Hello guys, welcome to Redditor's Revenge. Here we post amazing revenge stories daily. And if you want more content like this, please do subscribe to the channel and stay tuned with us. Moving on to today's first story, which is about OP's father abandoning him and his mother for years because he doesn't want to be responsible. So OP's grandfather disciplined him and eventually kicked him out of his inheritance. Now story. My grandfather was pretty much forced to save our life pretty much by getting my father, his son, to pay child support and fix his mistakes. I never actually saw my dad, as at first when I was young, my mom told me that he had to travel somewhere and he was gone for years, so I figured that there was something else going on. When I got a little bit older, she told me that he actually left right when I was born and that he may not come back. This destroyed me mentally, and growing up without a dad made some serious problems for me. The more I grew older though, the more I cared less and less about having a father and cared more about our deteriorating financial situation. Since my mom was working minimum wage in very tiring jobs in our town like busting tables, and I was too young to get any money, so our life was very poor, and we barely had anyone except for my grandpa, who was my dad's father. Grandpa was completely different from my father. He was a well-respected man in our town who gave us as much money as he could, even if it wasn't that much, but he did what he could. The problem was, my mom was always shy and embarrassed about talking to my grandpa, and she always feared that he was like his son, so we barely visited him and I barely got to spend any time with him. Still, he helped me when he could, but my mom was always distrustful. The problem was that my dad wasn't paying any kind of child support as he divorced my mom right when I was born. We desperately needed that money, and the more I got older, the more we needed it even more. I was then 15 and things were getting worse and worse, and we would pretty much be forced to live homeless if it continued like this, so I needed to find my father. The year was 1998. I knew I couldn't find him alone, as this was before any kind of social media or ease of technology, so I went to the one man who could help me, my grandpa. I told him that I was sorry to put him in such a tough situation, as I knew that he probably still loved his son. But he was also very fair, and I knew that he would help me. I sat down with him and asked him to help us. He told me that he was sorry he couldn't do more with money, but that his financial situation wasn't great to begin with, and he did all he could. I told him that I knew that, but he was the only one I could go to. I asked him how the whole thing started, since my mom always refused to give me any details about my dad and what happened between them. Grandpa started by telling me how my mom and dad met in the first place. Dad was a few years older than mom. My mom was still in college, and they used to both go to this art exhibit every other week. My mom was young and beautiful, but my dad was pretty much a player. Grandpa told me that he used to get out with a lot of women and never settled down until he met my mom in that exhibit. They talked for a while about art and apparently they fell in love, but my grandpa thinks otherwise. When my dad told him about her, he only ever mentioned how beautiful she was and how fun she was, and he never talked about anything else, like her responsibility or her ability to be a good wife. Because we came from a smaller town, early marriage was very common. Grandpa didn't approve of the marriage, not because of my mom, but because he knew my dad was reckless and just wanted her because she was young and attractive, and that's all he cared about. Then, my dad married my mom behind my grandpa's back, forced her to leave college, and they traveled for a bit across the country, as my dad didn't have one stable job. Grandpa tells me that ever since that moment, he had a big rift between him and my dad, and when my grandpa tried to talk some sense into him, my dad told him that he was a foolish old man, and that he didn't care what he thought. Anyway, they were married for a couple of years, and my grandpa didn't know anything until they moved back to the town because my mom was pregnant. Grandpa tells me this was the only time where he felt somewhat close to his son, but that the night before my birth, Dad told him how scared he was and how he didn't want a kid and that he was very rude about it. Grandpa tried to talk to him about responsibility, and it was such a big fight between them that my grandpa kicked him out and threatened to disown him if he didn't raise me. The next day, I was born without my dad in the hospital, and he left without a trace. After Grandpa told me about the story, he told me that he would help me find him, but that he didn't want me to come with him. I asked him why, but he didn't give me any reason and just told me that this was the only way it should be done. We went back to my house and he told my mom and promised her that he would find him and make him pay all the child support. My mom had a moment of connection with my grandpa and thanked him, telling him that he was a better man than my father. I didn't know what my grandpa was doing until he found my father 3 months later, and my mom told me the whole story. He started by traveling to another city where my dad had an apartment and searched everywhere for him. He didn't find him but found some traces, like his friends or ex-coworkers who told him that he moved around a lot and that they had no idea where to find him. Grandpa went to the one person who may know where Dad went, Dad's mom, my grandma, who was Grandpa's second wife, and apparently, she was a horrible person to the point where Grandpa took my dad away from her when he was still a child, and left because she was a drug addict who put my dad in danger as a child. Grandpa went to visit her in an old people's home, rehab, where she had stayed for the last few years recovering from her drug addiction and just staying there because she was old and had no one. Mom tells me that she didn't even remember him from how bad her mind had gotten, but she could remember names and basic stuff. He kept asking her about her son, and while she gave very vague, confused answers at first, she finally remembered both of them and broke down crying, telling him that she was sorry and that she didn't even know what she was doing. Grandpa sympathized with her, even if he hadn't seen her in like 40 years. She begged him to stay with her, but he just wanted to know where Dad was. She struggled to remember at first but told him that someone came to visit her and left a number. Dad took that number and the area code was for a completely different city, so he had to go on another road trip. Before going over to Dad's state, however, my grandpa recruited one of his dearest friends to help him. Grandpa's friend was a retired CIA officer, so he pretty much knew everything there is to know about finding someone, and he promised my grandpa to help him. They both traveled to that city, and even though they called the number a million times, the number never picked up. They were on a new quest now to find out where my dad was, so they spent days looking through phone books and stations, asking around, showing pictures, and going through hell to find him until they came across another lead. They found someone who knew him and he told them where he lived, so Grandpa and his friend went over there to investigate. Mom tells me that they did find him, but the encounter was horrible. My dad looked very rough and he screamed at his father, telling him that he never wanted to see him again, and asking him why he came to find him in the first place. When my grandpa tried to talk to him, my dad wanted to kick both of them out, but they refused, so he called the police. Grandpa and his friend felt that it was pointless, so they left to go talk to him the next day. They stayed in the car all night on a stakeout waiting for him to leave, but he never showed up. They went back into the building to ask about him, but one person there told them that he left in the middle of the night and had his bags with him. They were now forced to find him in another place. They asked everyone in the building if he ever mentioned anything about leaving, and they told them that he was packing to go to Dallas, Texas for work in a couple of days, so they headed over there to try and find him before he runs away again. On their road trip to Texas, one of Grandpa's friend's contacts called him and told him that my dad had a long list of felonies and missed court dates, and they figured that was why he was running away and moving so often. Pretty much everyone was on his tail and he was going to prison either way, but they had to find him first. In Texas, it was the same as before. They kept asking around until they miraculously found him in the same motel they were staying at. The place wasn't his property this time, so he couldn't threaten them with the police, and they forced themselves into his room to talk to him. Grandpa kept asking him why he was running and why he left in the first place, but Dad got aggressive and tried to fight them. My grandpas held him down, beat him up, and broke 2 of his ribs. My dad was no match for him, and my grandpa was too disappointed and angry about his son to stop it. Grandpa threatened my dad that if he didn't go back to the town, kiss my mom's feet, and start paying child support, he would have his friend cut off Dad's fingers. Grandpa's friend was already on the phone and made arrangements for my dad to be driven back to our town, and my grandpa told him that he would make an example out of him in front of everybody, since everybody in the town loved and respected him. 3 months had passed since I talked to my grandpa, and I pretty much lost hope in him finding my dad. We were barely getting by, and I just stopped caring. Way later, when we did get the child support money and my grandpa came back and passed away, my mom sat me down and told me the rest of the story. She told me that my grandpa, his friend, and Dad did get back to the town one day super late at night while I was asleep, and nobody woke me up to tell me anything. My mom and the whole town went outside, and my grandpa made an example of my dad in front of everyone he knew about how he was a failure. The town laughed at my dad, even his friends he knew from school. My dad finally agreed to pay most of the child support money, and he did. The next day, however, my dad disappeared again, probably because of all the illegal activity he had done and the cases he was involved in. That might have been the last opportunity I had to see my dad, but Mom insisted that it was better for me never to see him. Mom continued the story, however, and told me that after getting the child support money, we managed to pay all our debts and things became much better. Before my grandpa passed away, we got much closer to him and things were starting to look up. My mom told me that the night my dad disappeared again, my grandpa sat her down and told her the reason my dad left in the first place, as she never knew and just thought he stopped caring. He told her that because his mom never raised him, Grandpa struggled with his son and his son grew up to have this complex towards women where he only saw them as temporary pleasures, and that he had this actual issue towards feeling affection for anyone and commitment because he didn't have his mom. My mom told me that for a single moment, she felt bad for my dad but that it didn't excuse what he had done. My grandpa didn't pass away in the town, however, because he left right after Dad left again, and I didn't know anything until my mom told me. She told me that he left the town to go back to his ex-wife and that the time he spent with her when he was looking for my dad struck feelings that he hadn't felt in forever, and he went back to her old people's come to try to reconnect and take care of her, as she was now clear of the drugs. Mom told me that Grandpa took her out of the home and that they went back together since they never really officially divorced and lived together for a couple of years before he passed away. Mom was telling me this whole story on the day Grandpa's will was supposed to be distributed. We attended the reading of his will and it was the biggest surprise I had ever heard. Grandpa left everything he had for my mom, including his house and all his belongings. The lawyer told us that he also left us this rare collection of antiques he had, that he had no idea how valuable they were. The lawyer tells us the antiques, who Grandpa thought were just junk, were appraised at over $500,000. We couldn't believe how things turned in an instant like that. Grandpa was there for us at the end, even if he didn't even know it. The most notable thing, however, was that he didn't leave a single dime for his son. I didn't know if my dad would even know if his dad or anything about the inheritance, but he did and he called my mom to talk to her about it. Mom told me that Dad called her to ask her how she got Grandpa to leave everything for her. He told her that she was selfish and a horrible person for taking all of his dad's money and assets and leaving nothing for him, and that he needed the money to pay off debts and the illegal stuff he was involved in. My mom told him that she hadn't seen him in 16 years and snapped on the phone. She told him that he was a spineless coward who didn't care about anything or anyone other than himself and dragged him for leaving us all those years ago. She told him that she was glad he was never part of my life because she didn't want me to end up like him. Things became much heated, and she eventually threatened to call the cops on him because he was already running away from the authorities. After their call, I never heard anything else about my dad in my entire life. My mom and I lived our life comfortably together for years, and we had a great time. Even though it was just me and her without my grandpa, we made it work and even went to visit my grandma and give our condolences to my grandpa. She was doing much better and looked to be in a great place in her life. She told us crazy stories about her old life and the whole drug problem, but that the year she spent with my grandpa was worth everything she suffered for. In the end, I was glad I didn't know or see my father because I didn't know how I would have handled seeing him or if he would have been a bad influence. I don't even know what happened to him with the whole lawsuit against him, but he seemed to be still on the run. Now, here is the end of our first story. I hope you enjoyed the revenge OP's grandfather took on his whole son. And I believe he deserved everything that's coming for him, for being a selfish person and not caring about others. Guys, let me know what's your opinion about this story, and also what you guys think about who is responsible for OP's dad's careless and irresponsible behavior. Please share your opinions in the comments section, and I would love to read them. So before moving to the final story, please hit the like button and do subscribe to the channel to stay tuned with us for more awesome stories.
Now, moving to our final story, which is a quick but satisfying revenge story about how OPs killed a tow company with one simple phone call. Now story. Several years back I went to work for a towing company. It's about all I know how to do other than paint cars, which is drastically affecting my health. The pay was pretty decent, but we had to share trucks and the boss felt that he knew where we needed to sit to get the best calls. This is important for later. Several months in, I realized that I was not making the type of money that I should be making. So I took the opportunity while I was sitting in a parking lot one evening to start researching the laws about employees in similar positions. He was kind of in a hole and the trucks had transponders so that he could see if we had them idling with the air conditioner on a hot day or idling with the heat on a cold day. He was always calling complaining about something if the wheels were not turning. During my research, I discovered that if he was requiring us to sit in a certain parking lot, street, or any location of his choosing, then we were entitled to be paid an hourly wage, not just our commission. The technical term was engaged to wait, however, if he allowed us to freely roam about. While we waited for calls, we were not entitled to hourly wages, and we were therefore considered waiting to be engaged. I never mentioned this to him, but I did start taking note of my time. Another month or so goes by and he decided to start coming down on me for tiny little BS. Things that ordinarily wouldn't even matter, such as I forgot a popkin in the cup holder. He had a screaming fit about that. At this point, I was tired of working there and had already found another job, so I decided it was time to put my plan into motion. I called him up and told him that we needed to have a conversation about my final wages and that we could meet at his convenience. Upon entering the office, I laid out my argument, explained the state law, and told him I expected to be paid for the hours that I was on the clock, but not freely allowed to roam looking for work or able to do things of my choosing. He told me in no uncertain terms would not be paid for that time, as that was agreed to upon my employment. I did not bother to argue, as I already had my next step planned, so I took my final check and I left. The following Monday, I made a phone call to the State Labor Board, where I laid out my case to them. Needless to say, they were very interested in what was going on. In the end, they came to review his employment records and speak to the drivers still working. When he got the bill of what he had to pay us all, it was too much for him to afford, so he sold the trucks, his boat, and lot and went out of business. I never got the money owed to me in full, only a fraction, but the satisfaction of knowing the law just a little bit better than he did and watching it all burn was pure bliss. Now, here is the end of our today's story. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Guys, let me know if you had any encounters with such bosses in your life and what's your opinion about them in the comments section. So before leaving, please hit the like button and do subscribe to the channel to stay tuned with us for more awesome stories.